Hello, everyone. I'm Tyler Williams. For those that don't know me, I am the VP for the Sport and Exercise Science Division for Asahperd. And I have the privilege today to be joined by Dr. Courteney Benjamin, who's one of my fellow colleagues here at Stanford University. And so we're bringing Courteney on to talk about the topic of heat and hydration, which is very relevant for physical activity and recreational activities and sport activities in the state of Alabama. So Courteney, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm excited to talk about all those fun topics today.
Absolutely. Well, for the audience, kind of the agenda for today is we have a list of questions, some that I've developed as well as some that have come in from the audience related to the topics of heat and hydration. So I'm going to throw these questions out to Courteney, and we'll see kind of where the discussion takes us on some of these questions. So first question is, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a bit about how you got into this field and maybe kind of your background within this field.
Yeah, so I started off as an athlete. That's really the foundation, I think, of what got me into studying what I've studied so far. I played a lot of sports growing up. I was involved in gymnastics when I was younger, and then really shifted over and started getting pretty competitive in soccer. And I went to the University of West Florida, which is a D2 school down in Pensacola, for my undergraduate degree, and I played soccer there for 4 years. Prior to going to college, I tore my ACL when I was a senior in high school, and going through that whole process of, physical therapy, surgery, all that fun stuff, I thought, oh, this would be a fun career, physical therapy. That sounds fun. I like to exercise and work out, and, I had a great relationship with my physical therapist. So I thought that would be great. So that was my plan. I went to UWF and studied exercise science there. And the end of the summer going into my senior year of college, I tore my ACL a second time. And still at that time, I was full, planning on PT. I had done all the prereqs and all that fun stuff. But I tore my ACL a second time. And I think that it was 100% God that had that happen for me to realize that that was not really what he had called me to do. I hadn't really even thought about what he had called me to do at that point. It was just kind of what seemed natural and easy. And going through physical therapy that second time is really what got me thinking, like, I don't know if this is what I actually want to do forever. It didn't seem like it was. And so I started just praying about it and thinking more and more about what I wanted to do. And I got a really cool opportunity as an undergrad to do an internship with one of our assistant professors at UWF named Dr. Eric Greska. He was biomechanics, so totally different than what I ended up studying, but that was my first exposure to research and really getting familiar with what research even was and how it works. And I really liked it. So I decided I was going to get my master's and see how that went and see if I really did like this whole research thing. So I graduated in December of 2013, so a semester early for my undergrad, and then I got an internship at Florida State University. I worked with the strength and conditioning department at Florida State. Hadn't taken my CSCS, or Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist certification at that time, but I was really interested in the human performance side of things. Didn't really know what I wanted to do yet with that, but I went there, asked them for an internship. I got one, and worked with a lot of the different strength and conditioning coaches there. They encouraged me to get my CSCS. So the summer after that internship, I studied and took the exam that July. And then that August, they offered me a graduate assistant position in the strength and conditioning department there. So at Florida State, throughout my master's degree in sports sciences, I worked as a strength and conditioning coach with the women's soccer team primarily. So I worked with, but I also got to help with a lot of other sports as well. And I loved strength and conditioning. I loved that profession. I just was always one that was asking a lot of questions about everything that we did. And I realized that I loved asking questions and finding answers to them. So I did a lot with the wearable technology stuff with the women's soccer team. And there's still, especially back then, but even now, there's still much unknown about how to use that technology practically. And I was really passionate about that. So I decided that I wanted to keep on going to school and started emailing advisors and got email back from Dr. Doug Casa up at the Corey Stringer Institute at the University of Connecticut. His background is really in thermal physiology and treating exertional heat stroke, and he's an athletic trainer. I had absolutely no experience with that whatsoever going into it, but I explained, I'm really passionate about athlete performance and taking research and trying to find ways to apply it in athletic settings. And he really liked that I wanted to do the more applicable side of research. So he offered me a graduate assistant position up there with him. So I went up there from 2016, and then I finished my PhD up there in 2020. And so that 4 years is really where I learned almost everything that I learned about exercise in the heat and hydration. So I spent those 4 years really doing research around helping athletes prepare to exercise in the heat and having best practices when it comes to hydration strategies.
Yeah. And so, talking about exercise in the heat, you recently went back up to Connecticut before the Olympics, and you worked with the women's national soccer team before they took off to Tokyo. And really the purpose of that is to help them prepare for the environmental demands of Tokyo. And what people may not know is it was really hot and humid over there. So can you kind of tell the audience a little bit about why exercising in the heat is typically harder and more stressful on the body than exercising in a cooler environment?
Yeah, of course. So basically what happens when we exercise in general, right? Whether it be in the heat or in a air conditioning gym or air conditioned gym, our body naturally produces heat. And typically we call that in the science world metabolic heat production. So that's just part of, you guys have, most people listening to this have probably experienced it if they've worked out in their life ever. That's why we typically do a warm up, or why you start to feel warmer and sweat when you work out, even when it is 50 or 30 degrees outside. Is because our bodies are producing heat, mechanical heat, to do that work that we're doing during physical activity. So the problem, or I guess the reason that exercise in the heat is so much more difficult and puts so much more demand on us, is now our bodies are not only producing a lot of heat, but they're also competing with the environment that we're exercising in. And so what happens when we exercise is we start to produce sweat typically. And the primary way that our body cools off when we exercise is through that sweat evaporating off of our skin into the air. The problem when it's really hot and really humid is our body heats up faster, and then our body is then not able to evaporate our sweat as efficiently because of that humid environment that we're in. And so what ultimately ends up happening is our body stores that excess heat, and we get a rise in internal body temperature. And so what that does essentially physiologically and perceptually is it makes our heart rate go up a lot higher than it would if we were in an air conditioned or cooler environment. It makes our body temperature elevated substantially more than it would be if we were in a cooler environment. And then it also does things like make us feel worse. And most people, again, listening, have probably experienced this. Even if you're just watching, a game out in the heat, you feel hot and you don't feel happy. You feel not like you're having a good time. You also feel like you're working harder than you would normally when you're in a cooler environment. So that's why strategies to help with exercise in the heat are extremely important. And going back to what you said at the start of this question about the women's soccer team, this Olympics was actually, I don't want to say the hottest, but I'm pretty sure it was either the hottest or one of the hottest ever recorded Summer Olympics. I haven't actually gone back and looked at the data yet, but it was definitely on the top of the list for one of the hottest Olympics. And so we are going to talk, I know at some point, Tyler, about heat acclimatization and heat acclimation, but that's the strategy that we were really primarily helping them with to get ready for the Olympics in Tokyo.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, as you kind of alluded to, when we're exercising, we're active in the heat, it definitely puts additional demands on the body, which makes performance typically can be worse. And the perception is that it's harder, but it also too presents a safety hazard, right? And so there's different heat illnesses. And unfortunately, in the state of Alabama, it's not completely uncommon for there to be deaths associated with exercising in the heat. So can you maybe talk about the differences between the different heat illnesses, maybe how a coach or, somebody can identify that and how those heat illnesses should be treated?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, when we exercise in the heat, one of the decrements or one of the, downfalls of what happens with our body is we get this rise in internal body temperature. Okay. And so internal body temperature is a different measurement than our skin temperature. All right. And so right now, I know with COVID still kind of fresh on all of our minds, we've all gotten used to temperature scans and getting our temperature checked when we go into a doctor's office. Those devices are great for assessing body temperature at rest. However, when we exercise, our body does a lot of complicated things that it's shunting blood away from our organs to our working muscles to try to help cool us off. And what that essentially does is make those devices not as valid at truly telling you what your actual body temperature is. And so during exercise, our body temperatures, core body temperatures, can actually get up to 103, 104 sometimes Fahrenheit, which is very, very warm. Most of us, would experience extreme pain if we were experiencing that when we're at rest. But at exercise, that does happen quite a bit, especially when we're exercising in the heat. And so with that rise in internal body temperature, unfortunately, comes risks of heat illness. And so some of the most common ones that are out there are typical, what you probably are not going to be surprised that I say, like fainting or heat syncope. That's a really common one. Dehydration is a really common one. Edema or experiencing swelling is a common one that can happen, especially if you're trying to intake too much fluid compared to how much sodium you have available to you. And you'll experience what's called hyponatremia. And that's basically the sensation or the process of your cells essentially drowning in fluid because of either a lack of sodium or too much fluid intake at one time without giving your body enough time to process it. So we can talk more about that one if you want me to explain it more later, Tyler. Exertional heat exhaustion or just heat exhaustion is another common one that occurs. And then the most deadly or the deadliest of all of the heat illnesses would be exertional heat stroke. And so a lot of people, a myth, I guess, that a lot of people have with these heat illnesses is that they come on a spectrum, right? And so they think that, first a person will have heat syncope, then they would have heat exhaustion. And then after those things, if we didn't treat them and we continued to force them to exercise, then they would have exertional heat stroke. That is not true. You can have exertional heat stroke without ever experiencing any of the other heat illnesses prior to that. And so the primary way that you assess or determine whether or not someone has exertional heat stroke is a valid measure of internal body temperature and central nervous system dysfunction. And so central nervous system dysfunction can look anything like someone collapsing on the field, out on a play or out while they're doing conditioning, all the way to I've seen people talking crazy and like they sound like they don't know where they are or who they are, and they're just completely all over the place. That's kind of the spectrum that you get from CNS dysfunction. And then, like I said, the second measure is a valid internal body temperature above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. 104 to 104.5 is kind of the range. There's three valid ways to assess internal body temperature. Typically, this is going to be done by your athletic trainer, EMS, or a physician. So rectal temperature is the most common way that athletic trainers, especially, that's in their best practices to assess whether or not someone is having an exertional heat stroke. Esophageal temperature is the second valid way. That's even worse than the first one. It's as bad as it sounds. It's a probe that goes up the nose, down the throat, down into the esophagus, about at the level of your heart. That's how far down it will go for body temperature. And then the last one is an ingestible thermistor. So what that essentially is a little Bluetooth pill that's about two times the size of Tylenol. You would have to have the athlete obviously ingest that before practice. So it's not one that can necessarily be used to treat exertional heat stroke, because they would have had to take the pill prior to. But it's a Bluetooth pill that you can use a little receiver, and you hold it up to the athlete's belly, and it gives you a valid internal body temperature assessment. And so that's the two ways that you would assess and determine whether or not someone has an exertional heat stroke. And the reason that we want to assess this, because I get a lot of questions about, this assessment method for athletes, and saying, oh, if we think that they're having a heat stroke, can't we just go ahead and do the treatment process, which, Tyler, we can talk about the treatment in a second. The problem with that is there's a lot of other different illnesses that present as the same symptoms, as in CNS dysfunction. So you can have an athlete who is experiencing hyponatremia, which is what I talked about earlier, which is the overconsumption of fluid that presents with CNS dysfunction. You can have an athlete present with CNS dysfunction for other reasons, like medication or any other type of, other types of illnesses that are not related necessarily to exertional heat stroke. So that's why getting that valid internal body temperature assessment is really needed to rule out some of those other potential illnesses.
Yeah, that's really useful information. And so kind of the role of a coach or somebody that's helping these athletes or individuals that are just recreationally physically active is to be able to prevent those types of instances and not have to treat them, right? And so one of the ways that we can prevent these heat-related illnesses is through the process of heat acclimatization. Can you explain to the audience what that means, and what are some of these strategies that we can use if we're wanting to use it for ourselves, or if we're working with athletes? How can we prepare them to be able to exercise in the heat more safely, but also effectively where it doesn't negatively impact their performance?
Yeah, so heat acclimatization is personally my favorite heat mitigation strategy. There's other ones out there, but to me, it's my favorite because it's the most practical and it's the most user-friendly, easy to implement with any athlete. And basically what heat acclimatization is the process of gradually increasing your exposure to exercise in the heat systematically over a period of 7 to 14 days. So what's really incredible about this whole process is most of the time, if I were to ask you how long would it take you to improve your aerobic fitness, in general, people would say anywhere from 6 weeks to, sometimes when you get into really trained people, 6 to 8 months, worth of training before they see really big improvements. With heat acclimatization, we see people get a significantly lower heart rate, a significantly lower internal body temperature, a significantly higher sweat rate, which is a good thing, right? Because the more sweat we have, the more likely we are to remove it and cool our bodies off. And we feel better when we're exercising perceptually, which will ultimately all result in increased exercise performance. And so all of that can happen in as short of a time as 7 to 14 days worth of training. And so there's a lot of different guidelines that are out there. I know there's several different resources that have different guidelines for, American football versus soccer versus cross country, and how maybe to consider doing that. But essentially what it means is you will want to look at the ultimate training load or training goal that you would want your athlete to achieve in that environmental condition. And you would want to drastically reduce both the intensity and the duration of that exercise session on day one, and then gradually increase the intensity and duration every single day until you get to day 14. And what that does is it allows your body to adapt to that to those environmental conditions, and ultimately will help the athlete have all of these positive adaptations that can keep them safer and help them with exercise performance.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And so kind of in line with that, with heat acclimatization, we often talk about when you're exercising the heat, the importance of staying hydrated. Can you kind of speak to the role that hydration and fluid consumption plays in making sure that we can stay safe when we're exercising the heat, as well as improve performance, perhaps?
Yeah, so hydration is particularly important for that sweating mechanism that I talked about a few minutes ago. So when we exercise in the heat, we sweat. I think I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know about that. But what happens, we want to sweat more because then we're able to cool our bodies off through that evaporation that I talked about at the beginning. But what happens over time is, because we're continuously losing fluid through our sweat, if we're not replacing it through just water or other beverages that are out there, is we start to become hypohydrated or dehydrated. We lose fluid. And so what that ultimately results in, again, just like exercise in the heat, is increases in heart rate, elevated core temperature, greater feelings of perceived exertion, and will ultimately, because of all those things, lower your exercise performance. And so the three different ways that I kind of like to think about hydration in terms of, practical strategies to use is before exercise, during exercise, and after exercise. That's kind of the three bubbles that I like to put them in. So you want to start off by making sure that the athlete is hydrated before they start. One of the easiest ways to do that is through having them look at their urine color. So lighter urine color is indicating you are more well hydrated, and darker urine color is indicating that you're more dehydrated. Easy way to remember it, it's kind of weird, but it helps other people remember it, is if your urine looks like lemonade, good. If it looks like apple juice, bad. Need to drink more water. So lemonade's good, apple juice is bad. That's kind of the colors to go off of. Another way that you can assess hydration before exercise is looking at your body weight, your nude body mass. So we can talk a little bit about that if we have time, Tyler, about how to calculate sweat rate, but you can track your hydration first thing in the morning by weighing yourself every single day. And so a lot of times people will, do a new diet. What's a popular diet, Tyler? All of these
Yeah,
popular
like the
diets.
ketogenic diet.
Yeah. So they'll do the ketogenic diet or the paleo diet or, whatever. And, in the first 3 to 7 days, they see, oh my gosh, I've lost, 1.5 pounds. The diet's working. Most of the time, those small fluctuations that you see in that really short amount of time have a lot to do with your hydration status. And so when we go on diets like this, when we are most of the time going to be cutting back on the number of calories that we're consuming, well, water typically goes with food that we consume. So if you're not eating foods that have fluid in them, you're going to be a little bit more dehydrated, and that's going to result in you weighing a little bit less. Even if you're not on a diet, little fluctuations that you see from day to day in body mass are primarily going to be related to hydration. So if you assess yourself by stepping on the scale Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, on Thursday, if you're 1 pound heavier, that means you probably are a little more hydrated. And if you're 1 pound lighter, you're probably a little less hydrated. So that's a practical way to look at your hydration status before practice. During practice, there's a lot of factors that go into, how should you consume fluid during exercise. A lot of it depends on the intensity, the heat, the type of exercise. Is it, super high intense aerobic, or is it more strength and power? Typically the rule of thumb that I like to go on, or that I like to go by, is if it's less intense and cooler, drinking to thirst, or just drinking when you feel thirsty, is probably a good practice. So having water around when you feel like drinking, take in water. However, in other sports like soccer, football, lacrosse, things like that, that are out in the heat for really long periods of time, most of the time you actually are not going to replace the fluid as well as you would in a lower intensity exercise setting. So in general, some athletes can drink to thirst and they're okay with it. Other athletes, they may need to come up with some sort of a plan to measure out and determine how much fluid they need to consume. And one way that you can do that is by measuring your sweat rate. And so that's a super easy thing to do. I measure mine a couple times a year at least, because it can fluctuate throughout the year depending on your training or, what fitness level you're at right now. But basically all you do to measure your sweat rate is you weigh yourself before an exercise, and then you weigh yourself again at the end of exercise. Typically you want it to be as minimally clothed as possible, because sweat can stick to your clothes and soak into that. And we want to basically not account for what's been lost in sweat. We want to get rid of it, or we do want to account for it. So you weigh yourself before and after, and then you get an estimate, of how much you drink. So like for this, this bottle, I think is 30 ounces. So you don't have to weigh it. You don't need a scale. You can just estimate, I drank, I don't know, 20 ounces so far today. Add that back in to what your body weight change was and multiply it out by, if you exercise for 30 minutes, you want to multiply that by 2 to get what your sweat rate would be per hour of exercise. And then you can kind of have an idea of how much you're losing in sweat. And then you typically don't want to go more than 2% of your body mass loss. That's really the big rule of thumb with exercise in the heat. And these field athletes, that can practice sometimes for 2 hours at a time. If you're losing more than 2% of your body mass, you're not drinking enough during practice.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so you kind of talked about the idea of we have different time periods around the exercise trial where we are ingesting fluids. And so one of those is typically after we get on exercise, we're trying to replenish the fluids that we lost during the exercise. Even though if we're consuming fluids during the exercise bout, we're probably still trying to replenish anything that we lost. And so you see a lot of times now people, either they're being marketed to, or they have this belief that I need to be consuming sport beverages, or now you see them consuming like Pedialyte, different types of things like that that are very high in electrolytes. Can you give us some of your thoughts on, is it necessary to consume these sport beverages? Perhaps maybe there are certain circumstances that would require that, but can you just kind of talk generally about what that would look like?
Yeah, for sure. I love that question. So sport beverages in general are not needed in any exercise that's less than 60 minutes. So if you're going on a 30-minute jog around your neighborhood, I would say water would probably be perfectly fine. Once you start getting above 60 minutes and especially above 90 minutes, that's when it becomes really, really critical to not only have electrolytes in your beverages, but also carbohydrates. And so glucose, fructose, things like that. That's what you're going to see in your Gatorades and your Powerades. That's how they became who they are, is through that special electrolyte and carbohydrate mix. And so typically if you are, like I said, exercising for less than 30 minutes and it's not super, super intense exercise, you can be perfectly fine with just water. If you're doing more than that, or if you're doing a really intense exercise bout for around 60 minutes, you probably want to consume some electrolyte and carbohydrate beverage. And the reason for that, Carbohydrates is a little bit different than electrolytes, so I'll split those up. Electrolytes, the reason we want to have those in our beverages is it actually helps our body to absorb the fluid that we're consuming. Carbohydrates do too, but sodium especially is one that's going to help the fluid actually get into our cells and allow us to hold on to the water versus constantly getting rid of it through urine. We also sweat out a lot of sodium. And so this is the reason that, if there's any heavy sweaters on the podcast or listening to the podcast, if you've ever experienced, after you go for a hard workout or a run, you look down at your black shirt and it has white little specks all over it, or on your sleeve where you wiped your forehead, that's sodium. That what you see in those white specks is sodium left over on your skin. And so we lose a lot of that in sweat when we exercise. And so we want to try to replenish those with our fluid beverage that we consume before and after practice or a game. Carbohydrates, like I said, those are a little bit different. Those are typically going to be a lot better for a little bit longer duration exercise, around 60 to 90 minutes or more, depending on the intensity. That the carbohydrates do help with the absorption of fluid, but their primary purpose is to fuel us for that exercise intensity. So when we exercise, we have what's called muscle glycogen, and that gets broken down, and we start to use that when we're in really long, intense bouts of exercise. And so we need the carbohydrates to continue to fuel us for the rest of that exercise. And so that's where the carbohydrate comes in.
Awesome. So you've helped a lot of people when it comes to hydration, and you get a lot of questions around that, and you see a lot of people's different habits. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see with hydration?
Good question. So I would say one of the most common mistakes would be people not realizing that their nutrition plays a role in their hydration. And what I mean by that is we don't just get our hydration from drinking water. We also get fluid from the foods that we eat. So it may not seem that way, but there is a decent amount of fluid in our foods. For example, a bowl of cereal. Most people don't just eat a bowl of cereal, or just the dry cereal. They put milk in the cereal. So that milk is still contributing to our hydration status. Any fruit that you consume, apples, watermelon, strawberry, I mean, any of that is going to have a good amount of water content. So any type of fruit that you eat is going to have that. And so I would say a lot of people don't realize that, and they don't take that really into account. And so especially athletes who typically don't eat a lot of food before they go into practice. This is fresh on my mind right now because I just talked to an athlete down at UCF who was feeling tired and not feeling hydrated at the end of practice. And once I asked him a lot of questions, it came down to he wasn't eating really barely any breakfast, and they were having practice at 11 o'clock in the morning. So I'm sure a lot of his fatigue was related to the carbohydrates, and him not having that. But I think some of it probably he felt really dehydrated because he didn't drink really anything either. And so I think a lot of times people don't consider how much fluid intake and timing of eating goes hand in hand. Typically, when you drink is when you eat. Hopefully people sip water throughout the day, but I was just thinking about this actually right before we got on this call. I just filled up this water bottle, and I just had lunch right before this, and I drank half of this water bottle because I was eating. And so I'll sip on this throughout the day, but it'll probably take me the whole rest of the afternoon to finish this, versus when I was eating, I drank half of it. So I think that's probably one of the big ones. Another big one that I see is people not really understanding the importance of sodium intake outside of just practice. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. Sodium's gotten a bad rep for high blood pressure and hypertension and things like that. And so people assume like, oh, I shouldn't, put sodium on any of my food. I don't need any sodium because it'll cause me to have high blood pressure. A lot of that research is actually not based on, actually testing or looking at that with athletes. A lot of that has been done looking at sedentary individuals, and a lot of the analyses have been correlational. And what I mean by that is they've just kind of drawn lines between, okay, we see that all these people have hypertension, and we also see that they also consume a lot of sodium. So therefore, we're going to assume that higher sodium is causing them to have high blood pressure. And that's not necessarily true. People who are very physically, I mean, just in general active, not even very physically active, but if you're active in general, if you sweat at all during the day, you're going to be losing some sodium. And so especially athletes who are losing a lot of fluid and a lot of sodium in a day through sweat, the first thing I tell them is to salt everything they eat. Salt their breakfast, lunch, and dinner, put salt on their toast, put salt on their pancakes, because ultimately at the end of the day, they're going to lose that sodium through sweat. I think a lot of the problems with high blood pressure and all of that comes from the sodium taking so long, and it's just kind of sitting there. It's not actually passing through the sweat like it would be with an athlete. So yeah, those are two of my biggest ones. There's more, but
yeah, nice. Well, a majority of our audience are within the school system, right? So physical educators, coaches. And so within the school system, they've now started implementing hydration stations. What are your thoughts on hydration stations and how that may, improve fluid availability, or what, impact do you see that making?
Yeah, so I think from the research of what we know right now, the more readily fluid can be available to a person at any given time, the better chance they're going to be hydrated. And so a lot of times, athletes are the same way. I have soccer as a perfect example of how fluid availability can negatively impact your hydration. In soccer, you have to go 45 minutes without drinking water, unless you're playing like outside mid and you can quickly run off and grab a sip, you're pretty much not going to get water for 45 minutes. And so different than football, right? Football, you get breaks all the time. And so what we see comparing those two sports is football players typically don't lose a ton of fluid during a game or a practice. Most of the time, the reason that they struggle with hydration is they don't show up hydrated to start with. And so the effects just compound. But generally during practice, they do a pretty good job of replacing what they lose. In my opinion, and my theory on that is because they have water all the time that they can drink. They get lots of breaks versus soccer players. They're kind of left with where they start. If their tank is already halfway empty when they start the game, by the time they get to halftime, they maybe have 3/4 of a tank left, and then they only have a very short window of time to get it back up to as high as they can before they have to go another 45 minutes again. And so I love the idea of hydration stations. I think, the more we can encourage people to constantly have fluid readily available to them, the more better hydration practices we're going to see. We just did a study at Asahperd actually with a couple of our undergraduate students that we're going to be hopefully publishing sometime soon, that they looked at two groups of runners who basically in one trial, they had a water bottle that they were holding the whole time. And in the other trial, they had stations set up where they could only drink fluid every 2 miles or so. And what we saw was that in the groups who were carrying the water bottles with them the whole time, they actually drank on average double the amount of fluid compared to the athletes who had to just stop at stations. And so that area of research is still kind of new, but based on that during sport, I would imagine that during, free living everyday life, the more you have access to fluid, the better hydrated you're going to be.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, are there any tips and recommendations that you would like to share with the audience to improve their hydration as well as exercise in the heat?
Yeah, I think, we kind of already touched on a lot of them, but quick, I guess, summary of what we talked about with the hydration, especially getting your body mass first thing in the morning consecutively and noticing fluctuations in that. That's going to be a great way to look at your hydration assessment or to look at your hydration in the morning. Second thing is during the morning, also looking at the color of your urine. So you can look at the color of your urine throughout the day and kind of see how your hydration is fluctuating. But typically first thing in the morning is when you're going to get the best overall picture of your hydration status, because that's after your body's just been, kind of at equilibrium for hopefully close to 8 hours when you're in bed. And then that first morning urine sample is typically really indicative of your hydration state. And then the last thing for hydration, and again, all three things can be done in the morning. I record it on my phone. I have a little notebook paper that I put it on, but I'm sure there's other ways out there to do it as well. If you feel thirsty. So if you wake up and you feel really, really, really thirsty, that's also a sign that you're probably not well hydrated. So there's a Venn diagram. I wish I could show you guys, but it's easy way to remember it is called the WUT, W-U-T Venn diagram. And so W stands for weight, U stands for urine, T stands for thirst. If two of those three things indicate that you're not hydrated, you're likely not going to be hydrated. If all three of those things indicate that you're not hydrated, you're very likely not hydrated right now. And so that's a practical way to assess your hydration status. For exercise in the heat, heat acclimatization, I would say, is number one. One thing I forgot to mention about that earlier, especially if we have any football coaches that are potentially going to be listening to this, is equipment matters for that too. And so more equipment or more clothing that's on the skin, the hotter your athlete is going to be. And so what's recommended, I know by a lot of national organizations, is to gradually increase not only the exercise intensity and duration, but also the amount of equipment that they have on, gradually increase that over time. So heat acclimatization is one of my favorite ways to help with performance in the heat. Staying hydrated is obviously another one. And then the third one that I would say that we didn't really get to touch on too much is cooling. So any kind of cooling modalities that are out there. Some popular ones that are out there now are ice vests people will wear. Fans are a great way to potentially lower body temperature while you're out on the field. Ice towels. I don't know if anyone else had that when I was a kid. The mom who brought the ice towels in the cooler was my favorite. Mm-hmm. And so there is some science behind that. Especially the more surface area you cover. That's really the name of the game when it comes to cooling. Same with exertional heat stroke. Once we diagnose it, the gold standard way to treat exertional heat stroke is with cold water immersion. And so what that basically is an ice bath. And so unfortunately, there was a player just this past summer, like you said earlier, Tyler, in Alabama, who passed away, football player from an EHS, exertional heat stroke. And so that really doesn't have to happen. There's 100% survivor rate if the athlete is treated appropriately. And how you treat them appropriately, cooling them with cold water immersion on site. So before they would ever go to the hospital, getting their body temperature down as quickly as you can, the athlete should walk away from it that day. But again, it's difficult, especially for coaches, because that's not really part of their practice necessarily. And so that's why I'm all about advocating for being sure to have some kind of medical staff on site, like an athletic trainer or EMS, who are trained and are prepared to, diagnose and treat that exertional heat stroke.
Yeah. Well, you've given us a lot of practical and useful information that we can take away. And I also want to mention that coming up at the fall conference, we have 3 presentations regarding these topics of exercise in the heat and hydration, coming from some of Dr. Benjamin's students that she's been mentoring over the past semester. And so if you want to learn more around these topics, we would definitely encourage you to come and join us for those sessions at the fall conference. But Courteney, as we conclude, if some of our audience members have questions related to hydration or heat acclimatization, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so definitely my email, I would say, is the easiest way. I love to help anything related to that. So please feel free if you have a question or you just want to talk through a situation or scenario related to any of this. I'm happy to do it. My email is cbenjami, Benjami, so Benjamin without the N at samford.edu.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation, and we really appreciate you joining us for this session today.
Thanks for having me. I had
All right.
fun.
Great. See ya.
Bye.